Hey, boo things. So, Lavanya Tryon here, author and life strategy counselor. I wanted to get on here really quickly and tell you all about the backside of boundaries. So, this is a conversation that I've had with my journeyers, that I've had with one-on-one, that I actually talk about in my courses. And I wanted to get on here on Instagram Live, but just to talk to you a little bit about what this looks like and what boundary guilt and blame looks like. Now, let's talk about boundaries in the first place. Because when we think about boundaries, when we think about looking at boundaries, we have to say many times people tell us to set boundaries. They tell us that we should set boundaries, but no one tells us how to set a boundary, right? We just say that you should set a boundary, but we don't know how. If you think about it, when you were a child, when you were growing up, you didn't have boundaries. Like your mom told you who to hug, where to sit, what to eat, what to wear. If you don't want to eat this, then you're going to go to bed hungry. If this is an uncle, go hug your uncle or go say hi to this person or speak to this person. Like you literally repeated back whatever your parents told you to repeat back. And that was a sign that you were being raised well. So we never learned how to set boundaries for ourselves, right? We never learned how to set boundaries for our space, for our time, for our energy. We were just told that. So then when we become a teenager, then we get into conforming. So we get into a mindset of, I don't know kind of who I am or what to do or what I'm supposed to do. So I'm just going to kind of follow the crowd. And so now I'm following other people that don't know how to set boundaries, right? That's never works out. And then when you become an adult, you go to college and you're forced, you're basically thrust into this environment where you're asked to make all of these decisions and set boundaries for yourself, but no one has actually taught you how to set boundaries. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how to set boundaries, but then also what we're going to talk about mostly is the backside of setting boundaries. So when we set boundaries, we have to understand that, and I'm looking at my notes over here, we have to understand that we set boundaries for ourselves. You can never impose a boundary on someone else, right? When I built a fence around my house, yes, I am building that fence in order to keep people out, but it is a boundary around my property. I can't go on my neighbor's yard and build a fence on their yard and say, oh, this is a boundary that I'm setting for you. We wouldn't do that in life, right? We wouldn't go into somebody else's yard and set a boundary, go build a fence in their yard. So why do we feel like we have to do this for a relationship? Like, why do we feel that for relationships or boundaries in our lives that we can set boundaries for other people? So think about it from that perspective. When you're thinking about setting a boundary, think about it from the perspective, can I build a fence on my neighbor's yard? If I can't, then I can't set a boundary for someone else either. I can set a boundary for myself. So when we set boundaries, we are setting boundaries around a certain situation or a certain area for ourselves. We are saying this is a boundary that I am setting for me. And setting boundaries happening when we aren't getting what we want or what we need, or we feel like we're setting a standard for how we want to be treated, right? So when we set that boundary, we have to be able to understand that I am enforcing this poor connection. If this is healthy for me, but not necessarily harmful for someone else. And that's when we're setting a boundary. We have to ask ourselves, am I helping myself or am I hurting someone else? And if I am setting this boundary to help myself, is this being good to me, not being bad to someone else, right? So think about that when you're setting a boundary. Say to yourself, I am being good to myself and not bad to somebody else, right? So when I set boundaries, now I don't have to feel bad. I don't have to feel guilty. I don't have to feel like I am doing somebody wrong, because I know that this boundary is about me. So it's not about them, right? It's not about you. So if it's about me, then I ask myself, is this good for me and where I am right now? Like, is this going to set me up for where I need to go? Is it going to either give me more energy, give me more time, give me more money, whatever that is that I need in order to fulfill my purpose? And if the answer is yes, then that's a good boundary. Right? Then that's a boundary that we need to set. But when we set boundaries, we have to remember that sometimes there's what's called a backside of that boundary. So typically when we set boundaries, other people are involved. When I set a fence around my house, that keeps certain people out. Certain people have to now get access into that fence. So that can make people feel two kind of ways. There's two different things that happen when we set boundaries. First is boundary guilt. The second one is boundary blame. Let's talk about boundary guilt first. Boundary guilt happens when I set a boundary that's good for me, but it affects someone else, and then I feel guilty about it. Okay. So this can be an example of, say, for example, you have a friend that y'all go out to eat, and every time y'all go out to eat, you end up picking up the tab. Like every single time y'all go out to eat, they always look at you to pick up the tab, right? And you don't necessarily have a problem with it per se. You may feel some kind of way, but you do it, and then you start to set a boundary to say, you know what, I'm not going to be able to pay for us. Or the next time I ask this person out to eat, I'm going to say, hey, it's not in my budget to pay for both meals this week. So can you afford your own meal? And that's setting a boundary with you, right? Say even worse, you've seen this person on their Instagram or their Facebook or their TikTok or whatever, and you see this person like always going shopping. Like they always got a new Amazon, Amazon boxes. Like their house looks like a fulfillment center, and they are posting about, how they went to lunch or they went to dinner or they did this or they did that. So here they are eating off of your dime every single time y'all go out, but yet, it's not a financial struggle for this person. It's more so that they're used to the fact that you never set a boundary in this area, right? So now, not only did you feel guilty when you set the boundary, now there's a little bit of resentment there, because now you feel like this person took advantage of you or took advantage of your kindness or whatever. And we have to recognize is the same way we set boundaries for ourselves, that when we don't set those boundaries, other people get the opportunity to be lackadaisical with our lack of boundaries, right? So this person, you have to go back and evaluate and say, did this person ever tell me they couldn't afford lunch? Did this person ever ask me for money? Or was this something that I started doing and I set up a norm? I set up a standard. I set up something that was expected in this area as well. So now I set the boundary, and now I feel guilty about the boundary that I set. Say I used to pay for one of my kids' cell phone, or I'm used to saying yes to everything my boss wants me to do at work, even though it's not my responsibility and I know it's somebody else's responsibility. Prime example for me, a couple of months ago, my boss asked me to take on another task, and I was already feeling overwhelmed. I was always at the point where I was like, you know what? I can't take on much more. And so I asked my boss asked me and said, hey, I want you to take on, this new task. And I immediately felt overwhelmed. I immediately felt like this is too much for me. So I told her, you know what? I'm not going to be able to do that task. And it ate me up. Like I had so much anxiety before I hit send. After I hit send, I kept refreshing my inbox to see if she had responded, because I was nervous. I felt guilty about setting a boundary. Now, I have to say this to say that this additional task was not within something that only I could do. It could have been given to someone else in my office. So when I set that boundary and said, hey, I already have these 6 things that you have me working on. Would you like me to give one of these 6 things away in order to put this other thing on my plate? Or I cannot take on this other thing. And when I set that boundary, I felt anxious. I felt nervous. And so I just want to make sure that you understand that that's okay. That's actually normal. It's actually normal when your mind is going through you have neural pathways that are in your brain. And a neural pathway is almost like an automatic route, right? And it's something that our brains build in our systems as we do something continuously. Then that brain builds that neural pathway. So think of it as example, if you go to work, you drive to work, right? How many of us remember our exact commute to work or back home? We don't. We drive on autopilot, right? Like we know, unless there's some traffic or unless somebody hits the brakes really quickly, we don't really remember our route to work and back home. Why? Because we do it so often, because our brains are really wired in that same way. So it's the same way with your boundaries. If you haven't set a boundary in your life, if you haven't set a way, if this is your norm, then that's on autopilot. It's autopilot for you to say yes. And this is very difficult for people who we call people pleasers, which I am a former people pleaser, so I know it's very difficult to set that boundary and say, okay, I'm used to saying yes to everything. And then when I say no, it's like hitting traffic. So now my body is alert, and now I'm kind of shocked out of that autopilot. And now I have to figure out, okay, what's going on here. And so that is perfectly normal. It's actually acceptable when you are setting a boundary to feel a bit of anxiety. So whenever you feel that anxiety, when you set that boundary or that guilt, ask yourself 2 questions. Is this good for me and where I am in my life right now? Is this good for me and where I am in my life right now? Which means, is this propelling me towards my purpose? Is this boundary helping me by giving me more time back, more energy back, more whatever back, or taking less off or more off of me? And then asking yourself the second question is, am I intentionally hurting someone else? If your answer is yes to the first one, which this is for me, and if your answer is no, that I'm not intentionally hurting someone else, then lean into the anxiety, lean into a bit of that guilt that you're feeling and say it's okay. It will pass. It will pass. You're building a new neural pathway. I am now carving out a road that used to say yes all the time. Now that road is being carved out for me to say, let me think about why I say yes. Let me think about if I should say yes. And so that's what we're doing, is we're rebuilding, rewiring a new neural pathway. And anytime you learn something new, it kind of takes some anxiety there. Just remember, just because it's your norm does not make it normal. Okay, I'm gonna repeat that again. Just because it's your norm does not make it normal. What does that mean? That means just because it's the way that you've always done it doesn't mean that's the way it's supposed to be done. Right? Just because it's always been some of us are so comfortable in our dysfunction because we've been living in it for so long that we don't even know that it is dysfunctional. Like, we don't even know that someone is taking advantage of us because we've done it for so long. So be okay with that boundary guilt when you feel that way, when you're setting that boundary. Because when we set boundaries on think of the fence. When I set a boundary, when I set a fence around my house, it is going to touch somebody else's yard. It's going to touch somebody else's boundary or somebody else's lack of boundaries. It's going to keep them out if they do not respect the boundary that is around my fence or around my emotions. And that's completely okay. Okay. So remember, you're starting a new habit, or you're setting a new standard, putting a limit on what you used to give freely, but was depleting you. It's going to feel uncomfortable. It's okay. Lean into that, but make sure that you answer those 2 questions. And if you answer those 2 questions, which is this good for me and where I am right now? Yes. Is this intentionally hurting someone else? No. Make sure that you stick with that boundary. Many times what we don't realize is that setting boundaries is never really the problem. Enforcing boundaries is typically the problem. We have no problem setting the boundary. Like, I have no problem saying no or saying yes sometimes. But what I have a problem with is when you push back on my no or my yes, when you touch my boundary, when you knock on the fence around whatever it is that I have a problem enforcing it. I have a problem reiterating. But why do we have a problem reiterating the boundary? Because of other people's feelings. Because now we allow this person to say, well, you're doing this to me, or you're making me feel this some kind of way. And when someone makes you feel a certain way based on a boundary that you've set, then what you have to say to that person is, this boundary is not about you. This boundary is about me. And when a boundary is about you, when a boundary is not, then there's nothing that this other person can say that will change that boundary, because the boundary was never made with them in mind, right? The boundary was set. If I have a habit, or if I'm at a place where I'm one of my successful friends or family members, and I always have family that's asking me for money, or friends that are hitting me up for free services or free things that I would normally sell to someone else, and they want it for free. Then when you set the boundary to say, hey, this is depleting me, therefore, this is the price that I will set for family and what they want to have as well. Or if I was to say, this is the boundary that I'm setting for how much money I will give to a friend or to a family member, and that's it. When I'm done, like if I set to say I will give $100 away each month, I will put $100 in an envelope. And if someone asks me for, hey, can I borrow some money? If I feel led to give them the $100, I feel led to give them the $100. If that's on the 2nd of the month, that means for the rest of the month, I have no more money to give. That does not mean I don't have any more money. that means I have no more money to give. That's the difference from a boundary. So I don't have to feel guilty because I'm not lying or I'm not saying something that's untrue by saying, oh, I don't have the money. I don't have any more money. I do. I simply have not allowed that. That's the boundary. I am at my boundary's limit at that point. And because that boundary is about me and not the other person, then I don't feel guilty about that. So be honest and understand that when you set a boundary for someone, when you set a boundary for yourself and it limits or takes away something that you were doing for them, they are going to feel some kind of way. They are. And that's okay. But repeat after me. I am not responsible for your feelings. Is it? I am not responsible for your feelings. You are not responsible for how someone feels based on a boundary that you set for yourself. It is okay. Listen, if the well is running dry and they are getting cut off, they are going to feel some kind of way. They're going to feel like, and they're going to try to make you feel even more guilty by saying, oh, you don't care about me, or, oh, you're just putting me out, or, oh, you're just, you're not helping me, or whatever the case may be. And that is okay. And lean into that and say, you know what? You have every right to feel that way. But again, this boundary was not set with you in mind. It was set with me in mind. So therefore, I am sorry that you feel like that this is infringing on you, but it is a boundary that I've set, so I have to enforce it. And that's okay. Let them feel what they feel. Let them say what they say, and then still set the boundary that's healthy for you. Because here's the thing. If you allow someone else's feelings to sway your boundary, then you end up back in the exact same place that you were that made you set the boundary in the first place. But now this person now knows that you're no longer going to enforce a boundary. So now you're not only dealing with the blame and the guilt, but now you're dealing with the trust of yourself, because now you can't even trust yourself to set and enforce a boundary. So when you set a boundary, be okay with someone else's feelings on that. And remember that because depending on how dependent they are on you, not setting that boundary, that's going to control how their feelings are, right? So if this person, like we talked about at the very beginning, if this person who every time we went out to dinner, I was the one that always picked up the tab. Now, if I set the boundary to say, hey, I don't have it in my budget in order for us for 2 meals, I'd still love to go to dinner with you, but I won't be able to pay your way. If this person stops in accepting the dinner invite, what does that tell you? Sometimes boundaries gets people out of our lives that never were for us in the first place. Sometimes people are using us, and the fact that we're not setting boundaries is allowing them permission to use us. So now that I'm no longer footing the bill for the lunches, we don't go to lunch anymore. That tells you something, right? That tells you that it wasn't really about your company. And is that someone that I really want to be in my circle? And that's gonna go back into that guilt. That's gonna go back into that feelings. Now you're gonna feel some kind of way, but you would rather hurt now and feel rejected now by setting that boundary than to continue in a relationship or a situation where this person was simply using you. Okay, so it's okay. Or if this person says, hey, I can't afford to go out to eat. Okay, well, let's go get a coffee. Right? Or, hey, you want to come over and hang out, or let's do a Zoom date, or let's, talk on the phone, whatever that is that doesn't involve you opening up your checkbook every time you meet with this person. Okay. So, after setting a boundary, if it does affect someone else, here's a tip. You can do what's called a buffer. What a buffer is a temporary support for them to adjust to the new boundary that you've set. So this is called a boundary buffer, basically. And what you're doing is, for example, if this friend that I have, like say I had a friend that I gave money to, this friend paid their rent, or let's say I have a friend that's living with me and has been living with me rent free for an extended amount of time, and now I am setting I'm setting the boundary to say, hey, either you're gonna have to find a new place to stay, or you're gonna have to start chipping in on rent, and we need to talk about when that's gonna start and how that's gonna look. Then this person you're gonna feel a little guilty because you're gonna feel like, oh, I'm putting this person out. But remember, unless you birth them and they under 18, you are not responsible for them. So do not allow that person to say, hey, you're going to make me go back to my mom's house, or you're going to make me, do whatever the case may be. where was this person before they met you? Right? Who was paying for their lunch before they met you? Whose couch was they sleeping on before they met you? Right? Remember, you're not responsible for someone else. So I'm not intentionally hurting you. I'm simply setting a boundary for what's good for me. So setting that buffer would say, hey, okay, we're going to start paying rent in May. So are you going to be able to do that? Can I help you find a job? Can I help you do your resume? Can I help apply for a job, help you apply for a job for in a certain way? Or if you're saying, okay, you're going to move out, then can I help? I can go with you and help you look at apartments. I can go with you and help set up some apartment walkthroughs for you. So that's a buffer. A buffer is saying, hey, I'm setting this boundary and I'm keeping this boundary, but I understand that this boundary is going to be a shock to you too. So because it's going to be a shock to you too, here's the buffer. And so and now remember, when you're setting a buffer, it needs to be temporary and it needs to be something that is between the boundary and what you used to do. Okay. So the buffer is not saying, okay, you can live with me for another 8 months rent free. That's not a buffer. A buffer can say, hey, you can live for another 3 months. And how much can you afford to pay in these 3 months until you either find a new place or you're able to pay the agreed upon rent? That's what a buffer is. So I just wanted to encourage you to say, these are things that when you set boundaries, when you learn to set boundaries, setting boundaries is typically not the problem. The problem is the backside of the boundaries and how we feel about that. That's why we don't enforce them. So remind yourself, I am doing this for me and for my purpose and where I am right now, and I am not intentionally hurting someone else. When you have those two internally, then you are able to deal with any of the guilt that comes up or anyone else's emotions. Because remember, boundaries are not about them, they're about you. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you got something out of this. I would love to hear from you in the comments, what you felt. If there's anybody on that wants to ask any questions, you can definitely come on and I will add you. You can request to join the video and I will add you and answer any questions. I'll be on here for just a few more moments if anyone has any questions. But I really wanted to just give you that information about boundaries, about boundary guilt, about boundary blame, and hopefully empower you as well. If you want to do a one-on-one strategy call, what a strategy call is an hour-long call that we get on and we talk about a specific area in your life that you need coaching on. So this is not a long-term commitment. It is a one call or as many calls as you want, but it starts off as a one call in order to help me, allow me to help you strategize through boundaries or through whatever that certain situation is that you want to. So click the link in my bio and you can schedule that strategy call as well. So thank y'all so much for watching. I hope y'all have a great rest of your evening. Bye.